Walking a path along the roots of Pikes Peak, you take a fork in the road to the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and whether that mysterious man dressed all in black who's standing in the corner might be the Dread Pirate Roberts. At a corner table, by the fire, are two people. One of them is saying that we should all be careful, because people in masks cannot be trusted. And that's me, Matthew Mellema, and welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Here at Believe to See, we explore the relationship between faith, art, and storytelling. Our goal is to help you connect the great story, the great stories, and our own stories in order to understand what it means to live with a Christian imagination. So listeners, let me take you back in time a couple months. So the Anselm Society will occasionally have these events, like different dinners, different smaller events. And at one of these, there was a dinner being hosted by an Anselm host, and the topic of the dinner was detective fiction. And those of you who've listened to the podcast for a while know that's kind of my thing, so obviously I wanted to go. And while I was there, struck up a conversation with another guy that we were, I believe it was our first real conversation together. And throughout the course of the evening, find out he was writing an article on The Princess Bride. And he was wondering if I would review it. So obviously I said yes. He shipped it over. I started looking it over, and then I wish I had a good excuse. I do not. But I did review. I did not get back to him notes in time for it to significantly help the article. But I did make a very important realization. His article on The Princess Bride, and specifically how the author of the original novel, William Goldman, used his background as a Jewish American author and how that Jewish sensibility informs the novel. Super fascinating stuff. So obviously, I'm very excited to have him come on and talk about this draft article that he's been working on. Connor Salter, welcome to the table.
Thanks, Matt.
I gave sort of a background on the article, and I want your take on it. But first of all, why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and how you came to start writing about The Princess Bride?
So yes, my name is Connor Salter. I'm a writer and editor. Lately, I've been doing a lot of work on the Inklings, had pieces published in Mere Orthodoxy, a few places like that. And this article began essentially with, I was curious why there hadn't seemed to have been a lot of work being done on The Princess Bride as comedy, and there have been a lot of short articles looking at Jewish comedy in it, but not really in depth. So that led into, how do I get deeper into that? And yeah, that led to this draft article we've talked about and a short side piece that I'm hoping will come out in Mythlore in about March.
All right. So I am guessing pretty much all of our listeners, and if any listeners this doesn't apply to, I'm impressed that you can stay so to yourself. So kudos. I'm guessing all of our listeners are aware of the movie, The Princess Bride, directed by Rob Reiner. And screenwriter was William Goldman, too. But what probably fewer people know is that this was based on a novel that William Goldman wrote a couple decades earlier, right?
That's right. He publishes it in 1979. He says it began as telling his daughters a story, and one of them wanted to hear a story about princesses, the other one about brides. So then he said, okay, I've got the title now. What do I do next? And it morphed into, okay, write a fantasy story. And the whole, from the movie, there's that whole idea of it's written by a guy named Morgenstern and grandfather reading it aloud to his child. That whole element of the child hearing this story becomes much bigger in the book because the child grows up, tries to refine the book again, and decides to abridge it for his own kids. And at that point, you realize that Goldman makes up a fictional version of himself who's rediscovering the book years later. So that adds a whole other layers of humor and irony to the whole story.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that really struck me because, like a lot of folks, I grew up watching The Princess Bride. I remember when I was little, my dad showed me the movie, and, being a boy, I was like, princesses, brides, no, that's a girl thing. But my dad's like, no, trust me, it's good, bear with it. And obviously it became one of my favorite movies. I did not read the book until college. And like you said, there are a lot of striking things about it, one of which is this sort of frame story. The story within a story takes on a lot more precedence, right? There's this fictionalized version of the author William Goldman, who, like you said, is trying to find this great work from his childhood, The Princess Bride, S. Morgenstern's classic tale of true love and high adventure. And that sort of takes on themes of its own. And there are all other pretty significant changes he makes to the themes, even if they stick on the plots. But before we get into the really important stuff, I want to ask you one of the questions that I noticed and I have not heard an answer for. Okay, so William Goldman, again, wrote the novel, wrote the screenplay. So he's behind both of these. In the in the book, Wesley is described by Buttercup as having eyes like the sea before the storm. But in the movie, he's described by Buttercup as having eyes like the sea after the storm. What do you think? Is that significant?
I I honestly don't know. I mean, that's the sort of thing it sounds like they may have improvised and said, "Oh, it worked out fine in that shot. We'll keep that for the movie." But you know, you never know. It could be. Yes, you're right. It is. What's the expression? Is it after the storm or before the storm? What's calm before the storm is the expression, right? In
Yes,
general,
calm before the storm, and that's how it is in the book, but then it gets changed to after the storm in the movie. So I'm wondering, did Goldman, upon reflection, feel like it was a better image? And if so, why? Is it because the sea is a different color? Does it connote something that, before the storm is gathering, but here the storm is over and it's more tranquil afterwards? I don't know.
I do, it's a very good question. I mean, I think part of me thinks it may just be that after the storm is easier to say as a line when you're saying it. Before has those are hard syllables to start a word with. So if you're an actor, after the storm is easier to say. But yeah, there is. You could maybe argue that most of Goldman's stories are dealing with what do we do after storms in life because he's very interested in
Oh.
this is my expectation of how the world will work. It's just been crushed. What do I do now? So
That is a fantastic segue. So let's get into this Jewish element because I'll
mhm.
just admit, again, I grew up watching the movie, loved the book. It did not really occur to me that it was particularly Jewish. Like not enough that was on the radar. How did this first get on your radar? What was it that you noticed about these works?
I think initially Miracle Max because you can tell if you watch that enough times that he has a very that's a very strong New York accent. Billy Crystal is doing for Max, and that kind of comedy, that kind of I'm neurotic and I'm telling you all about my neuroses is the kind of thing you get in Seinfeld and a lot of other famous Jewish comedies. So I was curious. Oh, has anyone done more with that? And what I found out over time is okay there is a strong tradition of Jewish comedy, which is about sort of exercising your neuroses. Rob Reiner talks about this in relation to his next movie is When Harry Met Sally, and he talks about there's a lot of Harry is vocalizing his pain after his divorce, and Reiner calls that the tradition of I've got pain, I've got pain.
Oh, what a wonderful tradition. But there's also a lot of this that ties into Goldman's background, and you get into this in your article. What about Goldman, the human being, leads into the Jewish themes that you find in the work?
It leads in an interesting way. He's born in Chicago into what he calls a non observant Jewish family. He does what he calls Sunday school for a semester. He may have meant, I don't know what the official term is for that, but some kind of Jewish Sunday school. He does that for a little bit, but he's never bar mitzvahed. And so, but he questions of what it means to be Jewish, even if you don't grow up in Judaism, keep coming up in his books. Like he wrote a book called The Thing of It Is, which is based on a real visit he did to Venice, where there was a historic Jewish ghetto, and his weird experience of visiting that, feeling that history of the anti-Semitism. And then someone accused him of stealing a watch while he was on that visit. So that led to funny questions about, am I being accused of stealing the watch because I'm Jewish? So
Mhm.
there's a lot of how do you there's a lot of sort of outside looking thing about the need to understand his Jewish heritage and also how to deal with his own experience of pretty significant child trauma. That comes up in various ways, and that of course becomes important to Princess Bride because the fictional version he's giving you is a really kind of neurotic Woody Allen kind of guy,
Hmm.
which again is that's the very 1970s Jewish humor tradition of I have my neurosis, I'm expressing my neurosis, trying to exercise it, and maybe laughing at myself as I go along.
Yeah, in the venue he takes, the fictional Goldman is through this story. And again, for the listeners there, I do not mean to exclude you if you're unfamiliar with the story. So I'll give a very quick rehash. So it is told, again, frame story. Father, reading this story to his son, or grandfather to his grandson. It's very classic fairy tale structure on the surface, where there's Buttercup, this beautiful young maiden, and she's in love with Wesley, who's this handsome farm boy. And then Wesley needs to rescue Buttercup from the evil Prince Humperdinck. He has a giant and a swords master helping him. It sounds very, very on the surface traditional, classic Western tradition fairy tale. But you point out that beneath that surface of everything looking normal, there's a lot of other stuff going below the surface. Tell us about that.
So there's a lot of comedy that kind of is created in the story about dealing with your expectations as disappointment goes in, which is, you remember that classic line from the movie is Inigo and Wesley are fighting, and Wesley says, "Get used to disappointment." That becomes a running theme in the story because everyone has these expectations that are being crushed. Wesley is supposed to come back after making his fortune. Apparently, he's killed by pirates. Fazzini thinks his master plan can't possibly be stopped. Then the man in black shows up and he keeps yelling, "Inconceivable." Inigo and no, I'm sorry. Fazzini is the one with the plan, but yeah, Fezzik and Inigo are supposed to stop the man in black. That doesn't work out. Buttercup gets away with Wesley for a while, but then he's killed on the machine. So it's constant tragic comedy of this is what I think is going to happen, and that expectation gets crushed. And that fits very much into what Jeremy Dauber would call Jewish humor. That's about how do you deal with life being suffering, and what do we do with that? So that kind of meets you in seeing, okay, this is a fantasy story that's going in a new direction because it's saying, well, what if the happy ending isn't happening? What do we do instead? What do we do if that's not how this is going to go?
Yeah, in those subverted expectations, I do think they come through in the movie, which I want to get more to the movie adaptation later. But focusing on the book, and again, I'm saying this assuming that most listeners have probably seen the movie, may or may not have read the book. But but these themes, like you said, these subverted expectations are way starker in the book. Like for one thing, Buttercup in the movie, she's Robin Wright, this beautiful actress. She's all regal and imposing. There's no obvious flaws. But in the book, Buttercup is seen as a very simple person, not very creative, not very thoughtful, a little dense, and like
Mm.
everyone needs to explain things to her a lot. So not the typical heroine. And then there's Wesley, again, the handsome farm boy who becomes this dashing hero. Sounds good at the beginning, but then it's subverted because after he saves Buttercup, he gets captured and killed. And then when he's brought back to life, he can't move. So again, he is totally subverted. And there's probably a lot of other examples that you can find there of these sort of subverted expectations for what on the surface is a very standard fairy tale.
Yes, exactly. There is that there are all those layers to it. There is also another great one is that you get stronger in the book is Inigo is trying to avenge his father, and he spends years and years and years training, and then he can't find the six-fingered man, and he's stuck for a long time. And again, also because that frame story we talked about is much stronger in the book, there's also disappointment there where the fictional Goldman is trying to find a copy of the book years later for his own son as a gift. And initially, he can't find it. There's this long story about him trying to call every bookstore in New York, trying to find it. Finally gets it after much haranguing, but his son is not like the book. And that's when he sort of, oh, I feel so crushed. What did I do as a parent? Why did I fail? And then the answer is, oh, the book is a lot longer. Okay, well then I'll abridge it for my son. And then that leads into the whole thing. There's stuff in the book about him going, yeah, there's 5 more pages about all the other women that Humperdinck looked for to get a wife. Let's skip all that and get to Buttercup, okay?
Yeah, and that is one of the things that I think took me the most getting used to when I read the book, having all this experience with the movie, is that the fictional persona of the William Goldman, the character, is a really striking character because you mentioned this in your draft article that he's very self absorbed, but not out of pride, but out of this crippling self doubt and this lack of self confidence. He's absolutely bombarded by all his various neuroses, and you talk, there's all these lines about how he like screws this up, he doesn't have a good relationship with his wife, doesn't have a good relationship with his 10-year-old son. Then he finally thinks, oh, I can be a good dad by buying my son the book that changed my life. And he finally gets it and realizes, oh, there's all this extra stuff in that's just awful, so I'm just going to give you the good parts version. But the, so let's talk about this sort of meta analysis to it, because there's the frame story that we've been talking about, but also there's a series of really funny footnotes throughout the book that give sort of this fake history that doesn't make any sense. So what do you think the footnotes do to contribute to this ethos you've been describing?
Well, I think they do a couple of things. The first one is they're important because they made it a serious book. And that was important for the period because at this point in his career, William Goldman is still mostly a novelist, and his editor had a PhD and only wanted to work with serious writers. So it's important because what it does is it makes the whole thing into a meta narrative, and that makes it a literary novel. So but yeah, so you get but I mean, Goldman said that what he really wanted to do was he thought he wanted to try and skip all of the boring stuff and just tell the story as well as he could. He wanted to skip all the Tolkien-esque backstory stuff. So what you end up with then is, yeah, there's a lot of little footnotes about. There's a whole lot more about Florinese history here, about how the Mountains of Madness or whatever are really important in this, and this. But that's all 50 pages. We don't need to hear about that. Or there's a whole bunch of stuff here about how Fezzik had to help Max go find the potion stuff. I'm going to skip all that and get to the big point. Max just made the pill, and so it adds, yeah, again, it makes the book feel literary, and it gives all these little funny little tidbits of, oh, that's kind of, what are we skipping here?
Yeah, it makes it feel literary, but in a mocking way. It's sort of like, okay, you want something literary? Here's footnotes. They're literary. But then the footnotes themselves are really funny, and they intentionally don't make any friggin' sense, right? Because they're internally contradictory. They'll have these crazy funny story asides. So to take just a few examples, like they'll they talk about Florin, which is the country, the made up country where this story takes place, as if it's a real place. So, William Goldman's father is a Florinese immigrant, and they talk about Wesley and Buttercup as if they're historical figures. And there's professors of Florinese literature at Columbia, and they talk about how, this place lives in it's a world where like blue jeans exist and America has been founded, but like carriages and like other things haven't been invented yet. It's like, what? This doesn't make any sense. So it's like, the first recorded instance of jealousy was when David of Galilee first felt jealousy over his neighbor Saul's cactus. So that sort of stuff, again, doesn't it's intentionally ridiculous, but it does also give this meta commentary to drive home the main point.
Yes, and there's Sean Egan, who wrote the Goldman biography, gives a really funny example. You've got Florin the country, and then you've got Gilder. A florin and a guilder are names for the exact same coin. That's so you see the joke there. And yes, but yeah, you're right. The big point he seems to be getting at is just sort of you could almost argue that the point is sort of like that line from the Tale of Despereaux. Reader, do you believe in happy endings? That may be the best way to describe the whole story, is just we're deconstructing a fantasy story is supposed to have a happy ending. Everyone's supposed to run off into the sunset and things work out. And they sort of do in the book, but there's all these layers of, well, will they really work out long term? And then as you get more into the frame story, you're more left with, will Bill Goldman really find happiness even if he abridges the book just right for his son? We're not. It's so we're it's critiquing a little bit what you expect from a fantasy story to suggest maybe kind of push you to rethink what you should expect, which goes deeper into the Jewish humor thing because, as Jeremy Dauber puts it, a lot of Jewish humor is about dealing with generational trauma. Like Jeremy Dauber's book is called Jewish Comedy: A Serious History, and he basically says, yeah, a lot of one important narrative in Jewish history is that there's been persecution and struggle for a long time, from Egyptian slavery to Babylon ransacks Jerusalem, Rome sacks Jerusalem, centuries and centuries of all this pain. And Judaism promises that it will eventually get better because God will eventually set things right. But what do you do if you don't believe that? Which is where it gets tough for Goldman, because Goldman's not an observant Jew. He's a secular Jew. So you have to deal with, well, how do I deal with all of this generational pain if I don't believe that God's going to set things up at the end? And that becomes to be important in the book because he won't give you a easy, happy ending.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important point. So I'll give a quick spoiler alert for the folks who again have seen the movie, maybe wanting to read the book. Skip ahead about 30 seconds, but the ending of the book is quite different from the ending of the movie. The movie ends, Buttercup and Wesley share this big old romantic kiss, and the grandfather and the grandson share like this moment, and it's all good. But in the book, after Wesley and Buttercup escape, then it's made perfectly clear that Humperdinck rallies his guards and they're chasing them. So, like you say, it's sort of this Lady and the Tiger sort of thing where it's an intentional cliffhanger where we're like, do they actually escape? And even if they escape Humperdinck here, will they actually be happy in the future? Will, Inigo be happy once now that he's finally had his vengeance? It's left very unclear, as if the storyteller, Goldman's like, nope, I am not giving you your happy ending because guess what? Life isn't fair.
Yes, and that even the original version of the book, published in I think 79, ends with him even saying, I don't believe in true love and adventure anymore. I believe life's fairer than death. That's what the fictional Goldman is saying at the end. It's saying, yeah, I heard this book story as a kid. I believed in true love and adventure then. I don't anymore. And then
Yep.
he even, in the late 90s, there was a new expanded edition of the book where he goes even further, and you find out the fictional Bill Goldman apparently got sued by Morgenstern's estate for coming out with an unauthorized abridgment, and he was in court for years and years and years, and they finally stopped because they found out, oh, there's another Morgenstern manuscript, and they want Stephen King to adapt that because he makes more money. And so then it becomes the tragedy and the sadness of, will my life get better? Just gets worse and worse and worse for the fictional Goldman. And yet on one level that makes sense given his personal story. He had a lot of some horrific childhood trauma, and he would manage to be very successful but always very unsure of himself in life. The interesting critique here, though, is that even though that's true, that line, life's fairer than death, leaves you wondering, well, that means you haven't given up to despair yet, because despair would be, well, why keep on living? And that's kind of Richard Anderson, who wrote a study of Goldman's novels in the late 70s, said that's kind of his recurring theme is, here's my expectation. It's going to get crushed, but I'm going to keep on. I'm going to endure and try to find the next thing. So it's not quite like the conventional Christian, I am waiting to see the redemption at the final coming. It's not the conventional Judaism that God will set things right at the final judgment. But it's not quite nihilism either. There's this need to keep going, which suggests he hasn't given up on hope quite yet.
Yeah, and one of the evidences of this is the fact that, the fictional Goldman still recognizes the power of this story, The Princess Bride, right? He still comes back to the book. He remembers the effect it had on him as a boy. So even though he officially no longer believes in true love and high adventure, he sure does spend a lot of time reading and telling the story of true love and high adventure. It's this juxtaposition, that this uneasy tension that he seems to have in his mind, where he officially has given up hope, but like you said, there's still something that he's clinging on to, even if he doesn't believe it's like the rational thing for him to do.
Yes, and you're right. And it becomes maybe especially poignant for a writer of his generation because he's born in 1931. I mean, the Holocaust starts when he's 2 years old. And as To the best of my knowledge, neither of his parents were Holocaust escapers or survivors, but it's for his generation. That's a big thing. Is you're mostly raised by, if your parents aren't survivors, you certainly have uncles and aunts who were, or you have stories about half the family that didn't make it over in the 30s and 40s. So that whole question of how do I deal with the generational trauma and the pain when something that big happened when I was growing up is tough. And that becomes big for Woody Allen. It becomes big for various other comedians who are Jewish. Is this whole thing of I don't really believe in God, and after all the trauma I saw my family go through, I have good reason. I don't know how to believe in God, but I don't know how to give up either. So you get things like Woody Allen's movie Crime and Misdemeanors, where it ends on a very cynical note where evil seems to win, but the very last shot of the movie is a rabbi dancing with his daughter at a wedding. So you're left with, okay, I can't quite give up on where I came from and my heritage, and I can't quite give up on hope, even if I'm unsure what I believe in anymore. So that tension.
Yeah, and you also mentioned in your article how a lot of Jewish writers of Goldman's generation have this. You can try to imagine it where their parents and grandparents' generation, he knows, endured this unspeakable trauma. He was too young to really know what was going on at the time, but he still feels this burden to preserve their pain, even though that might be impossible for him to do. So you argue that one of the ways that him and the other writers do this is through fiction. How do you think they did that?
Yes, so this gets a little into this gets more discussed with writers like Philip Roth, like 'cause Roth's book. Roth wrote an alternate history book where it's what if the Holocaust happened in America during FDR's administration, something along that line. So with Roth, especially, is this thing of how do I reimagine the story as if it could happen here, and that's a very clear message about how do we talk about how do we give you a warning and also deal with okay, I'm Jewish. My family went through this. I didn't experience it firsthand, but I have to talk about it and commemorate it even though I didn't go through it. So you get speculative takes on it where alternate history stories or Harlan Ellison, who's the same generation, very well known sci fi writer, did a story, I think, called Boulevard of Broken Dreams, where it's a Holocaust survivor dreaming of Nazi ghosts that he sees around the city. So there's moments like that where they may not be able to tell you their own story of what happened, but they can find ways to discuss it in genre ways or in through clever stories. So the one that's really clear with Goldman is he writes the thriller Marathon Man, where it's 1970s and this Nazi war criminal named Christian Zell is in New York trying to sell off some diamonds and all these creepy images about it's 73. Most of the diamond sellers are survivors, and yet there's this creepy criminal who's trying to sell them his diamonds. That becomes a creepy way to talk about the Holocaust, the aftermath, the pain, but in the context of it's a spy thriller. That makes this nice bridge where he can talk about the pain, he can talk about the Holocaust, and but in a more clever way that commemorates the pain without becoming pretentious or going into the fact that he wasn't there himself.
Yeah, and again, these are themes that I just totally missed going through it, and it's really helpful for me to think about them, on my next reading. But we're running a little low on time. Before we go, I want to talk a little bit about the movie, and again, I'm assuming that far more listeners have seen the movie than read the book. So we already touched on this, but what would you say are the biggest differences between the book and the movie?
I mean, it shortens the whole frame story a bit, but it also I think it goes for a happier ending because it ends with Buttercup and Wesley escape, and then it ends with the grandfather saying "as you wish." That's a much happier ending, and I think that partly just speaks to they knew they needed a more upbeat ending, but it also maybe it is kind of curious that it seems like Rob Reiner, who directed the movie, goes a lot more for happier endings in his movies. Have you seen you've seen This Is Spinal Tap or When Harry Met Sally? They all
Hmm.
go for a kind of very cute ending.
Yeah, is Rob Reiner is similar? Like, is he part of this like generation of Jewish men? Like,
Yeah, he's the
I
same
know he's about the
generation.
same age.
Yeah, and it's actually his father Carl Reiner did a lot of stuff with Mel Brooks earlier, and they would
Okay.
do lots of stuff with Jewish, like a lot of. I think it's from his Borscht Belt, which is sort of a particular kind of Jewish comedy you would see in Jewish vacation resorts in the '60s.
Hmm. Yeah. So that part, you were absolutely right. The ending, I would say, is the biggest difference. That as opposed to being like ambiguous and life isn't fair. It's like it's a happy ending. The the hero and the heroine kiss each other, and the grandfather says, "As you wish," and it's very nice. But would you say that, despite that, let's sort of say that they made some concessions to make it a more marketable movie? Do you think the movie still retains a lot of these elements of Jewish storytelling and Jewish comedy that you mentioned about the book?
Yes, partly because it just gets a lot of Jewish actors in it. You know, Mandy Patinkin, Billy Crystal. There's a lot of subtext you get from that. But and the grandfather is played by, forgetting his name now. You get even more of that because he's just sort of, he's the grumpy Jewish granddad. Yes, you're very smart. Shut up. So, yes, yeah, you get. I think you get a lot more of it. It just becomes more subtle because it doesn't want to go in for, the narrator is not going to go in to give you dark deconstruction, but you're going to get a lot more little touches of Jewish comedy that we now see much more of now because Seinfeld made that much more overt on a much to much wider audience that wasn't so true in the late '80s. So you still get it. It just is in little shuttle, little small moments throughout the story.
Yeah, and like you said, there's some characters like Miracle Max, played by Billy Crystal. You can totally see the sort of character that the Jewish Billy Crystal is going for, and that's pretty explicit in the film. But you also mentioned something, that how, looking at it that way, you could see Miracle Max, the very Jewish character, gets just sort of fired by the very Gentile seeming Prince Humperdinck, and how this sort of might encourage Miracle Max's revenge here. So even there, it does seem like some kind of traditional Jewish themes might slip through, even in the Hollywoodized version.
Yeah, you're right. There is a subtext where it seems like, okay, he's been fired maybe unjustly by his not Jewish employer, and maybe that becomes a Jewish revenge narrative, and maybe that's less clear in the movie. But there is, on the other hand, this whole thing that it is still, Max and Valerie are still kind of played as, they very much fit into a kind of, they have a lot of Jewish comedy mannerisms. Billy Crystal talked about, he kind of based it off of, he had relatives that were a lot like Max, and it's he riffs a little bit on Mel Brooks routines, and that all. So within that, you think, okay, you can clearly see we're talking about Jewish pain and how we deal with it and how we keep going, even if the whole question of why was Max fired doesn't get really addressed much in the movie.
Yeah, and also, with regards to the frame story, and again, the frame story for the movie is very much pared down to what it is in the book, but you do see some of those themes as well, because it's the grandfather who is reading it to his young grandson, and the grandfather absolutely plays like an immigrant character. Like, you can see him, you can imagine his backstory about how he came to America fleeing the persecution, and how he hasn't fully assimilated. Now his grandson is fully assimilated. He's trying to pass along this treasured story to the kid who just wants to play his video games. So it seems like it's sort of the niceified version of a similar theme, where it's trying to impart the pain of the older generation to a younger generation who might be growing up in a different world.
Yeah, you're right. There is, yeah, that grandfather is definitely. He makes you think of a as of an immigrant granddad, always pinching your cheek. Hey, how you doing, kid? And you're right. And there is the crux of that whole idea that he's passing on the pain of the nice to the grandson doesn't get it, is that whole part where after Wesley dies, where the granddad said, "Who said life is fair? Where is that written?" And that becomes this whole thing of, okay, what are we going to communicate here? And of course, it turns out Wesley still lives, but you see, yeah, there is a passing on of how do I help you understand the pain that life can have, maybe that I've experienced.
Yeah, and I that's a great point that you brought up, because in the movie they say what's pretty much the thesis of the book. Well, who said life is fair? Where's that written? And the grandfather doesn't let his grandson off the hook. He just sort of lets him sit with it and stew in it as he continues the story. It's a really great moment. So it is a way that screenwriter Goldman was able to capture the attitude of novelist Goldman.
Yes, exactly. It allows you to sit in that pain for a minute, even though the rest of the story can keep going. And at the same time, we can still have that moment at the end where
Mm-hmm.
the granddad is saying, "As you wish, Cleveland." He loves the kid. He'll come back, keep talking him through this. So that tension of despair and trauma, and yet also hope to keep on going and to figure these things out more.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, we are running low on time right now. And that's probably a good note to end it on. So, again, listeners, if for some reason you haven't seen the movie, go ahead and see it. It's great, but also read the book. It's also fantastic. Highly recommend it. And I highly recommend this article that Connor Salter is still working on. Connor, thank you so much. Where can we find you? Where can we find other work that you've done?
Well, let's see, I'm on LinkedIn as G Connor Salter, on Facebook as G Connor Salter. Um, Let me see. A lot of my work appears in Mythlore. That's an academic journal on inkling studies, and you can hoping to have a piece out through the Rabbit Room sometime in the next couple of months. We shall see. So yeah, check that out.
All right, great. Well, thank you once again. And to our listeners, you can probably tell that things are winding down at the Anselm Society Digital Pub. The fire is down to embers, the customers are trundling home, and you've polished off your final glass. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. If you have a spare, say, 30 seconds or so, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening, and we will catch you next time.